Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 23rd week of 2015. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. AWARE is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. Many Americans are unaware that the Obama administration is making war in 8 countries around the world, 2 more than George Bush. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines, in violation of the Charter of the United Nations, which forbids the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. Most of us are also unaware that President Obama is sending American death squads, we call them Special Operations Forces, into more than 100 countries around the world, where their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. We're unaware that the U.S. President is conducting the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, a secret series of murders by drone that has already killed thousands, including American citizens and hundreds of children. And most of us don't know that the Obama administration is recklessly provoking war with Russia in Ukraine, where a U.S. proxy government has already killed thousands, more than U.S. client Israel killed in Gaza last year, and with China in the South China Sea. These U.S. wars are not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans, who are taxed to pay for them and are forced to forego government services, to the point that the U.S. is now the most unequal developed country, and is becoming more so, and at an increasing rate. But the wars are in the interest of a very few Americans, the very rich, the 1%, who profit enormously from U.S. control of the world economy. There are 2 areas that the U.S. particularly plans to control: the Mideast and Eurasia, which are connected by their possession of world energy resources, that is, gas and oil. About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, which also has 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. U.S. control over world energy gives it leverage over our economic rivals from Germany to China. Since World War II, the U.S. has demanded control over, not just access to, Mideast gas and oil, and our government has been willing to kill a lot of people to ensure it. Wars conducted by U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. Obama was elected on a platform of hope and change, but he's brought little hope and almost no change to U.S. war policy, except perhaps to lie more successfully about what he's doing than George Bush ever did. Obama's work for the 1%, and against the interests of the rest of us, is nowhere better illustrated than by the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the secret trade deal with 11 countries that he's trying to rush through Congress on a fast track, i.e. with no congressional amendments allowed. In fact, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is not primarily about trade. It's about increasing corporate profits, stopping governments from regulating corporations, and making people throughout the world pay more for intellectual property, medicine, software, etc. It's designed to carry forward the neoliberal project to maximize profit and business domination, to set working people in the world in competition with one another so as to lower wages, increasing the economic insecurity of the majority, and to protect the top wealth sector. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is not concerned with traditional concepts of trade agreements, such as lowering tariffs and increasing imports or exports. Instead, the TPP seeks to undermine regulations in sectors like food safety, medicine, and intellectual property by limiting government's ability to legislate within their own countries. By entangling such provisions with an agreement on international trade, the Obama administration would open up sovereign countries to unprecedented levels of interference by multinational corporations. It's significant that countries that have been ravaged by such globalization, leading to massively expanding inequality, like Brazil and India, have refused to join the trade agreement. We should be warned. Champaign-Urbana-Aware recommends you contact the President and our representatives in Congress and tell them to, first, stop killing people around the world. Second, bring all U.S. troops home from their mission of protecting the profits of the 1%. And third, stop trying to rig the international economy for the benefit of the rich and the detriment of the rest of us. The Aware webpage and Facebook page have email addresses and phone numbers for President Obama, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Mark Kirk, and Representative Rodney Davis, and also for our members of the state legislature for reasons we'll explain later. Tonight we'll talk about U.S. war making, which the government and media aren't talking about, with commentaries by Karen Aram on U.S. policy in Asia, and Ron Szoke, Who Lost Iraq? Who lost Iraq, Ron?
Well, there seems to be a developing argument about that, or rather a whole set of accusations and recriminations reminiscent of the old who lost China debate or flurry of accusations some years ago. You may remember there was something, a group within the Congress called the China Lobby, who were extremely hostile to the Chinese communists and the takeover by Mao Zedong, and constantly pressuring the American Congress to support Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist people, who eventually, having been defeated in about 1949, moved to the island of Formosa, and now called Taiwan, and still occupy that island. Both the nationalist Chinese on Taiwan and the mainland Chinese consider this a temporary break, and the islands to still be an organic part of China, but in theory, but of course they're not going to do anything about that. And if China makes any move, mainland China, to bring this about de facto, it has U.S. security guarantees that we will prevent that. So it's part of the continuing story of American global dominance. And it does raise the question, every time that some country or territory escapes from total American domination and control, who's responsible? And the going theories are, well, first of all, of course, among the Republican presidential candidates, it's Obama, of course, according to Jeb Bush, because he didn't put in enough troops fast enough. And this seems to be the going hypothesis among the Republican candidates and a lot of our more conservative friends, that what we need now is a massive injection of American boots on the ground, because the Iraqis themselves show no sign of actually wanting to fight. So what we have there is a continuing series, it seems, of military collapses by the supposed Iraqi army. The ISIS or ISIL group has taken Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, and so on. Interesting note on Mosul, when the Islamic State group took that, apparently they captured 2,300 Humvees, the American military fighting vehicle there. Is that really plausible that they could have lost 2,300 Humvees? But that's the reported figure. Yep. And most of the armaments of the ISIL group is apparently coming from the Iraqi army being surrendered by them, and they of course got it from the USA at an enormous, massive cost to the USA and to you, American taxpayer. Anyway, you can read in the American Spectator magazine, a really hair-raising right-wing publication. They're still agitating the question of who lost China, and of course it was the liberals, whatever that means. So who do we blame? The blame game still goes on, and it seems to be the major preoccupation of American politicians. When something goes wrong, we figure out who's to be blamed, who are the bad people who caused this, and we identify them and then eliminate them in one way or another. So who lost Iraq? The standard answer being, of course, that it was never ours to lose. But anyway, there's this underlying assumption that the entire planet is by natural right or by natural law ours to dominate and control, because we say we need to do that in order to protect ourselves and prevent any place in the world being used as a base for terrorists. And so the anti-terrorist campaign has developed into, as we saw some 10 or 12 years ago, a kind of global or cosmic war against evil. And I think a lot of Americans have become disillusioned by that in the 12 or 14 years since. But some people are still at it. We're fighting terrorism, we're fighting evil, and how we do it is by dominating and controlling all these other countries. So the war goes on in Iraq. We're being prepared for further escalation there. There have been many resolutions pronounced by our government, the White House, that there will be no additional boots on the ground there. But eventually, because we do have several thousand trainers there, the usual dynamic will develop, and they will be shot at. Then we'll have to put in a few more thousand military people to defend them, and then the escalation will start all over again. There will need to be a surge in order to deal with that, and on it goes. We just can't stop, can we? So who lost China? Who lost Iraq? I think that needs some questioning. A whole lot of people seem to have lost Iraq, in my view, because of mistaken views, assumptions about things, and inability to understand and to properly credit a different culture in a different country with different views of things. So that's how we can make sense of some of the question, who lost Iraq? First of all, it isn't lost, and it will never be regained by military action, as more and more people are admitting, it seems. But the message is, in many cases, not getting through, and there's this thesis still floating around in the air that what we need is more military action. And indeed, the language of military action is becoming more and more prominent. We're getting daily body counts again from the Middle East about the number of ISIS fighters that have been killed and so on. And it's not looking good. So we're being invited to arm ourselves again. And will we get to the stage of putting American troops explicitly on the ground? Well, they're there, as I indicated, to some extent now. And there are a lot of Iraqi soldiers, apparently, who are, in effect, mercenaries and are showing no particular will to fight, which is scandalizing our Secretary of Defense. But everyone had a hand in losing Iraq, I think, or whatever it turns out to be. So the prospect there is for endless war, endless fighting, endless killing and dying, and who's going to take the blame for it? Well, you can pick out your own favorite villain. So, who's yours, Carl?
Well, I think we don't have to look too far to examine a hegemonic country that is working for a worldwide economic control that benefits a tiny percentage of its population. That's the U.S. I think you and I actually have a certain difference in how we read what the U.S. is doing in things like losing Iraq and even losing China, which you quite rightly and appropriately say, you know, how come it was ours to lose, that language makes sense only if we assume that the world belongs to us, and therefore if something gets out of our control, we have lost something that we in some sense have a right to. That certainly is the way the United States talks, and the difference between you and me, I think, is that you want to suggest that these views, that sort of observation, arise from sort of a misperception and indeed of some psychological difficulty that at one point I think you compared to addiction, that we can't stop doing the sorts of things we've done in the years, particularly since the Second World War, in terms of insisting on economic and political control around the world. It's a misperception, it seems to me, if I understand you were right. And I think I want to defend, in a certain sense, the American government, American war policy around the world in all these years, yours in my lifetime, on the grounds that it's not a misperception, it's not mistakes, it's not stupidity that drives the policy, but viciousness. That the U.S. government is willing to do things that reasonable people find crimes in order to enhance the profits of its dominant social groups. Now, it's kind of hard to say that publicly. No conqueror ever says we're conquering this because we want it, we intend to enjoy it, and we're going to kill anybody who gets in our way. You don't say that. You say, no, we have to conquer this in order to liberate the people that we're conquering, or stop them from threatening us, which they're doing so viciously and can only be stopped from doing by our conquering them. That's, of course, what the U.S. has said all along, and it's a flat-out lie. The U.S. is, particularly since the Second World War, dealing with a world in which it is the major power, economic and military. When the Second World War ended, the U.S. was the only undamaged country, winners or losers from the Second World War. And in the years after the Second World War, the U.S. had somewhere in the neighborhood of 5% of the world's population and 50%, 50% of the world's wealth. And American planners, they understood that perfectly well, and they understood that the U.S. was going to be the object of envy and in the rest of the world because the imbalance was so great. And that American policy had to be a matter of finding ways to maintain that disparity. And the way they had to do it was by war, by military action either threatened or, in fact, carried out. But they had a big problem. And the big problem was that the American people were heartily tired of war in 1945. In fact, the history of the first half of the 20th century is the history of American governments cadging an anti-war people a pacifist people, that's what Americans were, into war, from the Spanish-American War through the First World War and into the Second World War, the biggest problem American governments going to war had was the fact that they were strongly resisted by the general understanding in the United States. When it came to be the case during the Vietnam War that an overwhelming majority of Americans came to the conclusion that the war in Vietnam was not just a mistake, as some people in the government were willing to say, but it was a crime. It was a crime that never should have happened. When that happened, when a majority of Americans began to believe that, they were in fact reverting to the standard American position, the standard position of the American populace, that the American government worked so hard to overcome. And indeed, in the years after Vietnam, the major difficulty American governments had was overcoming that reluctance of Americans to go kill people in other countries for the profits of the 1%. When the Reagan administration came into office in 1981, they had a problem with that in Latin America and wanted to put troops into Latin America the way that John Kennedy had put troops into Southeast Asia. In fact, the Reagan administration in 1981 modeled itself on the Kennedy administration, and the first thing they did was try to say we need an aggressive foreign policy that will include making our economic writ run in these strange places. For Kennedy, it was Southeast Asia. For Reagan, it was Central America. But what they found was that they could not do it. They could not do it. They could not send troops into Central America the way Kennedy had sent troops into Vietnam, because as a friend of mine a Vietnam veteran who worked as a bartender in Boston used to say, you can walk home from Nicaragua. There was an unwillingness to do that, and that was based on the fact that the Vietnam War ended because the American Army revolted. And the Reagan people had to drive their foreign policy underground. They had to run a secret war in Central America, a series of secret wars in Central America, because they could not rely on the belligerence of the American public, which can be ginned up at various times by the invocation of threats. We've lost China, the communists are coming, the communists are going to take Connecticut, therefore we've got to stop them in Vietnam. That only works so long. And what we're dealing with primarily when we talk about these matters is this vast propaganda construct where the American governments that want to maintain this economic control have to overcome the reluctance of Americans to kill people. Sometimes they're successful in doing it, but often they aren't. And the present situation in the Middle East has something of that character to it. The U.S. had to go to a mercenary army in the 1970s because of this observation, and we now run mercenary armies, both the actual military and the groups like Blackwater and so forth around the world, and they're doing their killing for us. Our special forces, as we say, in the Middle East and throughout the world, really, in more than 100 countries, are carrying on this sort of control. But we still need the government still needs the popular support that it gets only by lying to the American people, as we saw in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. And the line continues. The particular form that the lies of the Obama administration take are interesting, but the general situation remains the same. The U.S. government wants to carry on these wars around the world for economic control, and the biggest obstacle is Americans finding out the truth about what's going on. The job of our government is to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference in the way we construct our mental universes around questions like this. Example might be the supposed reluctance of the American people to go to war and kill people and so on. That was once, I think, a much stronger sense among Americans than it is today. What impresses me now is the readiness with which we pick up guns and go gunning for people. Amazingly enough, the official FBI figures for the number of people shot to death by the police over the last year amounts to just about over 1 per day on average. A newspaper, the Washington Post, has looked into this, and because they were suspicious of that figure, and has gone to other newspapers and sources all around the country. Police departments are not really required to report how many people they've killed, and there's no uniform national reporting of such things. So you have to piece the picture together from a whole lot of fragments, and the figure that they come up with is that on average the police are gunning down 2.6 people per day in this country recently. So,
and that may be an underestimate.
Yes, it probably is, but that's the best figure we have to go on. So I think our views on this have changed somewhat. We have a steady diet now. I notice young people watching horror movies and splatter movies and so on. And it was all treated in a very antiseptic way, going back to the Vietnam War, where the body counts were reported every day during what was called the 5 o'clock follies, the briefings by the military to all the reporters gathered there. But are we so inured now to the notion that we can off bad people by saying, well, they were evil and they deserve it? So how do we explain the differences of opinion on this and the different perceptions of what's going on? Well, different people, because of their life experiences, I think, have different ways of putting things together for themselves and constructing their mental universes, depending on their personal situation, what they've read, what they've seen, what they've heard about, who they admire and think is a authoritative or charismatic figure, and all of that. And I'm a little suspicious of the rush to judgment that happens in a lot of cases where there's premature moralism about these things. We must ultimately make judgments of right and wrong, good and evil, but I don't think I quite exist in the same stark black and white universe of good and evil that you do. I'm not that eager to condemn and to attribute viciousness and evil to people before I know a good deal more about the situation and all the different claims that are being made about what the right way to view things might be. So there is that difference there. And whether there is any ultimate or absolute truth in this matter, I'm not sure. But anyway, if the standard ways of explaining people who disagree with us politically in matters about this is either that they're stupid or that they're crazy. And
I want to argue they're rational. And
well, yeah. In a
they're neither
very
stupid nor
narrow and
crazy.
restricted sense, I would say.
Right.
But okay, if they're neither stupid nor crazy, another possibility is that they're just vicious and evil, and that may be the case in some cases. But I'm deeply suspicious of getting there too quickly. So. Do you think these people are demon possessed, or how did they become so evil, Carl?
Good heavens, Ron! This is an occasion on which we want to talk about Aristotelian morality and take seriously the notion of the fact that There is objective evil in the world committed by other human beings, and that's important to understand why and how that happens. That seems to be our task. We look at great crimes, and they are just that, committed by historical actors, and we have no trouble describing them as crimes if we talk about a generation ago or a century ago or in another part of the world, but applying the same standards to the life that late we led, we find more difficult. We have no problem talking about the crimes of the national rulers of the 20th century, but when it comes to the national rulers of the 21st century, we encounter difficulties. Why should that be? Well, it would seem to me that the first reason is a vast propaganda campaign on the part of the American government, the most sophisticated in the world, in which we're told that the American government's actions in killing people around the world is done in defense of America.
Yeah.
That we have to stop terrorists, we have to stop communists, we have to stop German imperialists, we have to stop the Spanish Empire, working backwards into the 19th century, because those people are going to harm us unless we stop them right now. This we've heard frequently throughout our lifetime about any of these official enemies. There's, I think, perhaps a deeper structure to this in a way that has to do with a very real American exceptionalism. We talk about American exceptionalism as in various ways, things that pertain to the United States that are not true or less true of other countries. And in most cases, we're deluded, I think, on that point, that there are more similarities between these societies than there are differences. But I think there is one area in which American exceptionalism works and accurately describes the situation we're dealing with. America from the beginning, and by America I mean the society established by European immigrants in North America from the 17th century on, what is exceptional about that society from the 17th century to today is that it is a remarkably fearful society. The great fear that our government is able to play on, that Americans have of communism in the last generation, terrorism in this generation, and so forth, really is unusual. Countries that are far less secure than the United States, surrounded by two oceans with no real enemies in its hemisphere, the very real fear that Americans feel is unusual, remarkably unusual today, and it stretches back, as I say, into the early years of European settlement in North America. Now, you don't have to think too long to think of some historical reasons why a society that is in fact remarkably secure should be so fearful, when that society is based on two of the greatest crimes in human history. Modern-day America depended upon the extinction of the Native Americans and the enslavement of the Native Africans. Now, any society based on crimes as monstrous as that, amongst the greatest crimes in human history, has a lot to be afraid of. There's a great fear that there may be some retribution in store for a society like this. And it's certainly true that even some of the phenomena that you've been talking about, like the American enthusiasm for guns and so forth, is based for most Americans today on fear. There are people out there who are going to get me unless I have a gun in my house that I can defend myself with. Now, Americans are unusual, I think, to the degree to which we think that, and it's not a new phenomenon. It's been around since the English colonists arrived in North America. We have a tradition, in other words, of seeing enemies that have to be stopped and have to be stopped by military means. There is a Latin maxim that we always hate the people we have injured. And it seems to me that that is close to the heart of American society and the fearfulness that leads to this belligerence. And our leaders understand that. Understand that to the point of saying Americans can be told, yes, the terrorists are going to come get you. The terrorists turn out to be some people who are trying to defend their own land half a world away. But the terrorists are going to come get you, and therefore we have to go kill them first. That works in America, and I think the reason it works runs very deep into the American psyche and American history.
Yeah. It's an interesting insight. I wasn't aware that it was that many centuries or millennia old, but in the book I've quoted here a couple of times by Tavris and her co-author, well, what's the name of it? Mistakes Were Made.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. That you often find when people slander other people, it's because they've wronged them first, and it's necessary then to discredit them afterwards to make it appear as if they were not worthy of any better treatment. But okay, there are many issues going here.
There are indeed. Maybe we could.
Yeah. Maybe we should move on to something a little more concrete.
We might point out that you're watching Aware on the Air, and we've been joined by our colleague Michael Bay. What's on your mind, Michael?
Since 2004, the United States has been conducting drone strikes to Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan. The rationale behind these attacks is that they make the US a safer and more peaceful place. According to Peace Nobel Prize laureate Barack Obama, drone strikes are only used when there is near certainty that no civilians will be killed or injured.
Wow.
The highest standard that we can set. Conservative estimations by the Council on Foreign Relations and the Bureau of Investigative Journalism prove the contrary.
Yes.
The US has killed almost 4,000 people in Pakistan with drone strikes, out of which only 2% were high-profile targets that are recognized leaders of Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Out of the remaining 98%, at least 400 were proven to be civilians and 170 children. The identity of the remaining victims is unknown due to the missing transparency and the disinformation that the United States government and the CIA practices. A drone pilot, Brendan Bryant, describes one of his missions to Pakistan in the following way. I was still feeling the effects of my first Hellfire shot. The intel, that stands for intelligence information, that we were given is that there was this commander and some of his people inside this building. And they had been watching it for multiple days. They had been keeping track of people that had gone in and out. And they had made the determination that those were the only people that were in there. And something ran around the corner. And it looked like a little person. And it made me realize that, you know, we can have all the intel in the world, and it's still not going to be perfect. And as clean as these types of strikes can be, they're in reality really dirty. Zuba Reiman, a victim of one of the drone strikes, describes his experience in the following way. On the day of the attack, my father was sleeping in the hujra. That stands for living room in Urdu. And I was doing schoolwork right next to him. When the drone hit, my father's body was scattered into pieces. He died immediately. I remained unconscious for 3 to 4 days. Since then, I have been disabled. My legs have become so skinny and weak that I cannot walk anymore. Both these statements from victims and pilots that are involved in the drone strikes show us that there cannot be certainty, full certainty that no innocent civilians are being murdered. But instead, there are only 2% of the entire of all people that are murdered are high-profile targets. That shows that the rationale behind these attacks is faulty and that the attacks are unnecessary, but instead provoke the population of Pakistan to regard the US as an enemy and facilitate the recruitment for Taliban in the Pakistani area. If the attacks continue, we will soon find more Taliban fighters, and our country will lose its reputation in the Middle East area. Thank you very much.
Michael, that's the most important question, I think, that may be facing Americans about the war that their government is carrying on right now. This drone program has been called by Noam Chomsky the greatest terrorist campaign in the modern world. And you're right to point out that the substitution of the drone program for troops on the ground in the Middle East and elsewhere by President Obama has cost the lives of 4,000 people in Pakistan alone, and more than 1,000 or more outside of Pakistan. You have to understand what's going on here. The U.S. says it's after, what was the phrase, high-profile targets. What's a high-profile target? A high-profile target is a person in a foreign country whom the United States has decided may one day decide to do something damaging to Americans. But in fact, what they're actually concerned about is that they may contribute to a political situation in their country which America cannot control. Now, this is outrageous on so many levels it isn't funny, and the U.S. activities, the choice of these high-profile targets by our president is a war crime comparable to some of the greatest war crimes of the last century. It is amazing that we accept this with the sort of aplomb that we do. And the reason is that we are conditioned by a propaganda regime that deals with our fears, that tells us we are being kept safe from terrorism by the American military operation, by the American global assassination program by drones. This is something that we, Americans in general, are guilty of in the sense that we allow our leaders to get away with it. That shouldn't keep up. And it is a crime comparable to the crimes in Southeast Asia of the 1960s and 70s. And it took Americans a decade to decide that those were crimes that they should not put up with. The Obama administration is quite aware of that situation, and that's the reason they're substituting the form of warfare that Michael has just described for the conscript army that we used in Vietnam. But our reaction has got to be the same. We've got to name these crimes, recognize how vicious they are, and put a stop to them. Ron?
Well, yeah, you keep recurring to this word crime. How do we tell whether something is a crime? It's a commonplace not only of legal theory, but in the Bible, actually, in St. Paul, that where there is no law, there is no crime. And
but you don't believe that?
Yeah. What?
But you don't believe that?
Well, I do in a sense. So we have to distinguish here, I think.
Are there crimes?
There are crimes, meaning violations against the law, where there is a law, and there are what you might call moral crimes, which seem to be what you're talking about. But where's the law there that's being violated? And I don't mean by law, in this sense, some matter of personal opinion and revulsion or whatever. But in order for there to be a crime, there has to be some pre-existing law that forbids a certain kind of action, and that law has to have a certain kind of source or validity coming from a legislature or some other ascertainable kind of source, and not just be my emphatic opinion about things. So how do we know whether something is a crime, Carl?
Did the Germans commit crimes in the course of the Second World War? German leadership, German government commit crimes in the course of the Second World War?
Well, yes and no. There was no...
Some did, some didn't.
Well, sometimes
some
they
did,
did, sometimes they didn't.
Okay.
But
Sometimes
again,
they
I'm trying
did,
to get
though.
a clarification here in my continuing project of cognitive hygiene, that there are a lot of unclear, festering ideas out there, and I'd just like for us to get clear about what we mean by that. So your thesis is that there could certainly be crimes where there is no law that is being violated.
Well, that was the position that the American government, or that was the situation the American government faced at the end of the Second World War in Europe, where the British leadership wanted simply to line the leaders of the German government up and execute them. And it was the United States, interestingly enough, that said, no, we can't do that. That would look like victor's justice, even if, in fact, we have criminals who should be dealt with one way or another. That great criminal actions did occur in the course of the war, and the people who were responsible for them should be held responsible. So what we did was establish a tribunal, an international tribunal in the city of Nuremberg, which ran a trial, a series of trials really, over the German leadership at the end of the war. A similar thing was done in Japan, and that's instructive in its way too. But the whole notion depends upon the fact, or the operation depends upon the fact, that there were indeed crimes committed by the German leadership during the war, and you could make an assessment as who was guilty of them and how guilty they were. And that's what the court's job was. And the lead American counsel for that Nuremberg pointed out at the time that in a striking image, he said, we're presenting a poison cup to our own leadership by saying that these people are guilty of crimes for which they can be executed. The U.S. executed a large number of the German leaders at the end of the war, because the same standards, the same principles would apply to our leadership. What the crimes we are descrying here are crimes that other governments may be guilty of, and if we are consistent, the punishments that we establish here could also be applied to our own leaders. That seems to me to be quite right. And the problem was not any difficulty of saying, oh, gee, there isn't any legal structure. The notion that there was a moral law, that there was an ethical structure that human beings understood that allowed them to say what these German leaders did were crimes, that's not hard to do. That's not difficult to come up with. And in fact, in the defense of the German leaders, there was rarely any offer of the notion that they can't be guilty because there isn't any law they violated. We were talking about a moral structure, crimes against humanity, matters of that sort that was taken for granted by all.
Okay, one of us is very mistaken about what happened, and that was the principal line of defense taken of the German High Command, that there was no law that they actually violated. This was a after-the-fact, ex post facto law, forbidden by the American Constitution, by the way, and you can't just make up laws as you go along, which was substantially what was done at Nuremberg in 1946. So when people approve of that or think that that maybe didn't happen, they're just saying that they approve so strongly of what was done that they're going to start calling it a law, a crime, a violation of the law, and this will make the subsequent verbal adjustments to deal with this.
Which was right.
And well,
Were the German leaders justly condemned or not?
I can't say.
Well, that I think is a problem.
It would have been actually morally cleaner to just execute them, some say, and not pretend that there was any moral or legal basis for what was done. It could have been straightforward victor's justice, and ultimately, I think morally you could justify that, but stop pretending that there was some crime committed or law that was violated.
But the launching of aggressive war, the supreme international crime, as Nuremberg called it, and not even any questions about the death camps and so forth, all of that you're willing to put aside and say, well, we don't know whether it was a crime or not, and by the way, there wasn't any statute in the book.
Not a matter of putting it aside at all. I condemn it just as strongly as anyone else does.
Well, if you condemn it just as strongly as anybody else does,
okay,
why do you object to calling it a crime?
Because of the confusion there in use of the term crime. There was no law against it, therefore it couldn't have been a crime.
But that's a verbal, evasion of a fundamental moral and political fact.
Well, to me, it seems like an insistence upon a fundamental moral and legal principle. But
was the American destruction of the Indians a crime?
there were many crimes committed.
Okay,
but,
good. That's all I'm wanting. There are many crimes committed. That's exactly right.
But,
there were many crimes committed in the course of the Second World War. Not all of them by Germans, by the way.
Yep.
There were many crimes committed in the course of that. But the notion that we somehow can ignore these crimes and ignore the crimes that are committed, as it were, in imitation of them by our government today seems to me to be a very dangerous doctrine, right?
Yeah, well, okay, it may or may not be, but okay, you can take possession of the word crime and all of its emotional
Wonderful.
impact.
What an advantage that is for us Americans to be the leading criminals, the leading political criminals in the world, and if quantitative judgments apply, that's surely the case.
We may add to the situation in Pakistan that the U.S. is not at war with Pakistan. So a military intervention violates the territorial integrity and Pakistan's sovereignty, because the Pakistani government doesn't consent the drone attacks. So there is indeed a law set, that is the UN Constitution, which is broken at this point. And we can say that this military intervention is a crime according to the UN Constitution.
Yeah.
That's certainly true, and that's a very good point. I mean, there is a structure of international law today that has its basis in the UN Charter that simply illegalizes, makes a legal crime, in the sense Ron's talking about, of most American foreign policy, most American foreign wars today.
I agree.
They are not being conducted under the control of the UN Charter and the UN Security Council. When Bill Clinton decided to attack the former Yugoslavia, his lawyers told him, and the federal lawyers informed him that the only way he could do it legally was to get a UN Security Council resolution that justified the supposedly humanitarian intervention that the U.S. was proposing in Serbia. That was a flat lie anyhow, and because that was a lie, the lawyers informed Bill Clinton that he wouldn't be able to get the Security Council resolution he wants. Okay, said Clinton, we'll do it with NATO. And they set up the style that has been followed in American Middle East wars for the last 15 years.
Yeah, well, that's become the fashion, of course, is to have your legal whores whip up a case for whatever it is you want to do, and then it will be kept secret in many cases, as the U.S. government has done. It will be illegal to say what's in it, but in this legal brief, supposedly it justifies torture, killing,
sure,
mass murder, whatever it is that you've set about doing.
But the point is that the crimes that we're speaking of, the war crimes the United States has been committing, are in fact part of a legal structure of the sort you're asking for, I think, if we ask about the state of international law since Nuremberg.
Yeah, well, international law is unfortunately a rather dubious thing.
As George Bush Jr. said, right?
Right, but
he wanted to call his international lawyer, if I remember correctly.
But so there are many problems with that. But this kind of argument goes on, as it's been going on for decades, and I just would like to contribute some clarity to it.
You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 23rd week of 2015. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Congratulations to Jason and his colleagues for winning 2 awards from the Alliance for Community Media. See the Facebook page for Aware for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, Aware on, and I should mention just one of those events this coming Saturday afternoon, where we'll have its regular anti-war demonstration on the corner of Main and Neal Streets in downtown Champaign from 2 to 4 p.m. That's Saturday, the 6th of June, the anniversary of D-Day, by the way. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.